They said the river didn't belong to anyone, but Cole knew better. It belonged to memories, to secrets, to the quiet echo of laughter that hadn't touched his ears in years. Before the ranch hardened him, before the weight of his father's name carved the boy out of him, there was a girl, wild-eyed, sharp-tongued, barefoot, and she didn't belong to his world any more than he belonged to hers. But for a while, they made one of their own, down by a bend in the river no one else knew. And it all began with a fall. The sun bled out across the horizon, casting molten gold over the high plains and setting the cottonwoods aflame. Cole tugged his hat down low and clicked his tongue at Scout, his horse, easing them off the main trail and onto the dusty slope that led to the river bend. It was his time of day, the hour the wind whispered through prairie grass, and the world held its breath. At 16, Cole Mercer was already more man than boy. The only son of a cattleman whose spine was forged in barbed wire and long winters, Cole had been raised on dust, sweat, and expectation. He could rope, ride, and shoot straighter than most grown men, but there was always something hollow in his chest, a space that no amount of work ever filled. That river, that stretch of silence and song, was where he went to breathe. And maybe, just maybe, it was to see her. He didn't know her name the first time they met. Hell, he didn't even see her coming. One moment he was chasing Scout through the reeds after the colt spooked at a jackrabbit. The next, he was flat on his back in the shallows, hat floating downstream and pride soaked through. Then came a laugh. It wasn't cruel. It was light, like sunlight breaking through cloud. "You always make such graceful entrances," a voice called from the bank. Cole blinked up, spitting river water. She stood barefoot on a flat stone, her dark braids catching the breeze, hands stained with berry juice and balancing smooth river rocks. Apache. Younger than him, maybe, or just wiser. "I reckon I had that comin'," he muttered, dragging his hat back and wringing it out. She smiled, barely, but it was enough to set something turning inside him. "Maybe next time, don't chase trouble into my backyard." That was how it started. No names, no promises. Just two young souls carving space in the no man's land between their worlds. The days that followed became ritual. Cole'd ride out under the guise of checking fences, pocketing little offerings from his side of the world, a brass button, a hawk feather, a length of cord. In exchange, she taught him the names of flowers that healed, the roots that burned, and how to listen when the wind changed. They skipped stones and mapped the sky with sticks. She drew with river mud and berry juice. He showed her how to carve a horse from driftwood. They shared more in silence than he shared with anyone back home. She was sharper than flint, and just as likely to cut through his pride with a word. But there was a softness in the way she watched the river, as if it carried her whole family's history, and some unspoken longing for more. One afternoon, Cole brought her a leather-bound notebook, traded for it at the general store with 2 days' worth of chore money. "I thought maybe we could fill it," he said, offering it like a confession. Her eyes lit up as she flipped through the blank pages. "With what?" He shrugged. "The river, the stars, whatever don't stay still long enough for anyone else to catch." They spent the whole day sketching. She, with slow precision, drew the twists of willow leaves, the patterns of turtle shells. He, messy and fast, scrawled horses mid-gallop and cloud shapes no one else saw. Their fingers brushed once, twice. Neither of them spoke on it. As the light dimmed and shadows spilled across the water, she grew quiet. He looked over, and she held out a stone, smooth, gray, still wet from the current. "This is for luck," she whispered. "Tie it to something you always carry. So you remember, you're never really alone." Cole didn't speak. He just nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat as she showed him how to knot the red thread tight around it. From that day forward, it never left his hat. Even after the sun dipped and the coyotes began to cry, Cole sat by the river, hat in his hands, fingers tracing the red-threaded stone. He didn't have the words to name what they were building, but he knew one thing. The river wasn't just water anymore. It was memory. It was her. If this story stirred something in you, partner, stick around. The river's just starting to speak. Subscribe now and ride with us through the rest of Cole and Nita's journey. The next bend might just change everything. Days passed, then weeks. The river became their rhythm. Cole came each time with dust on his boots and guilt in his bones, lying to his father about checking fence lines or moving cattle, just to steal a few hours at the bend where the world softened. Where no one asked him to be his father's son, and no one expected her to vanish into the shadows. Nita was always there first, crouched by the rocks or balancing along the thick tree roots that twisted like veins through the bank. Sometimes she'd have a garland of red willow leaves in her hair. Other times, nothing but that quiet, watchful gaze, like she could read the sky better than any calendar. She never asked why he came, and he never asked why she waited. They just were. Cole brought small things from the settlers' side, a tarnished brass button that had fallen from an old military coat, a piece of twine from the feed store. Once, a dull spoon, he said, reminded him of the way her laugh curved. Nita didn't return the same way. She shared knowledge, not goods. She pressed his hand to a small green leaf and told him it would pull pain from bee stings. She showed him how to read the breeze before it turned storm. Once, she warned him not to eat a certain wild berry. When he asked why, she didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned close and whispered, "Because I'd miss your foolish face." Cole had flushed, scratching the back of his neck, but he couldn't hide the grin. They made a game of silence, too. Long minutes stretched where neither spoke, just listened to the river murmuring through the reeds. Sometimes Cole would skip stones, cocky as ever, but Nita beat him every time, her throws graceful and precise. "Still can't beat a girl, huh?" she teased once. "Not one raised by rivers," he muttered, sulking with a crooked smile. They sketched in the notebook, filling pages with their world, cottonwoods leaning like old men, the curve of a hawk's wing, the shape of a cloud that looked too much like a bison to ignore. Nita's drawings were delicate, careful. Cole's were hurried and messy, but she never mocked them. Instead, she'd trace over his lines with her finger and say, "You draw with heart. That matters more than ink." But beneath it all, beneath the laughter and shared glances, was an understanding they never named. They were building something not meant to last. A secret world, suspended between sun and water, between boy and girl, between settler and Apache. And the world beyond their river was watching. Cole could feel it sometimes, in the way his father looked at him lately. Suspicious, questioning, like he could smell the truth on Cole's boots. And Nita? She'd grown quieter, more guarded. She'd flinch at distant riders, or turn her face from smoke rising in the distance. But for now, they had the river, and it was enough. Cole reached into his pocket one evening and pulled out a silver ring with no stone, bent slightly on one edge. "Found it by the old windmill," he said, handing it to her. "Ain't much use to me." Nita took it, turned it over in her hand, then slipped it onto a strand of hair. "Now it's a moon," she said. They laughed. And just for a little while longer, the world between worlds held. By midsummer, the river was running slow and warm, its banks blooming with yellow wildflowers and lazy dragonflies. Cole came earlier and stayed later now, the chores at the ranch piling up behind him like a storm he didn't want to outrun. He was chasing something different, and he found it in the way Nita crouched barefoot by the water, in the way her eyes searched the horizon like she knew the world was always shifting. They weren't children anymore. Not quite. The silence between them had grown deeper. Not from distance, but weight. Something unspoken had settled in, like the hush before a monsoon. Their sketches in the notebook had turned more personal. Her drawing of his face, half-finished but gentle. His awkward attempt at tracing her braid. Neither commented on it. They didn't need to. One afternoon, the kind that burns gold around the edges, Nita came with something in her hand. A stone, smooth and oval, no bigger than a walnut. Its color was strange. Pale gray with a single stripe of dark red across the center, like it had soaked up sunset itself. Cole was leaning against a tree, hat tilted low, when she stepped beside him and pressed the stone into his palm. "It's for luck," she said, quiet and sure. "But it's also for remembering." He blinked at it, turning it over. "It's heavy," he said, voice lower than usual. Nita nodded. "Some memories are." He looked at her then, not as a girl he'd bumped into, not as someone he'd traded feathers and drawings with, but as someone who could vanish tomorrow. And that terrified him more than snakes, more than his father's silence, more than anything. "What do I do with it?" he asked. She knelt, tugged at his hatband, and pulled a bit of red thread from her pocket. Carefully, she wrapped it around the stone and fastened it to the base of his hat, right above the brim. Her fingers worked slow and steady, like this was a ritual older than both of them. "Now it's yours," she said. "But it's also ours." He didn't speak. Couldn't. Something about the way the light caught in her eyes, the way her hair caught the breeze, the way the red thread glowed like fire against his weather-beaten hat. It was too much. "I'll keep it," he said at last. "Always." She smiled, but there was sadness in it. Like she knew the river would soon take more than it gave. That night, Cole lay in the hayloft, the stone still tied to his hat, his fingers brushing the thread again and again. He didn't know what it meant. Not fully. But he knew this. Whatever happened, whoever tried to pull them apart, a piece of her now rode with him. And if that wasn't a covenant, he didn't know what was. The sky had started to feel heavier. Not storm-heavy, but tight. Like the land itself was holding its breath. Cole noticed it first in town. The way folks whispered when Apache riders passed near the outskirts. The way Sheriff Talbert stood a little too still, one hand always resting near his holster. The ranchers talked more over whiskey and less over fences, words like tension and trouble slithering between gulps. But Cole didn't care. Not yet. Not until he saw the change in Nita. She started glancing over her shoulder more often, her shoulders held stiff beneath her buckskin shawl. Their conversations grew shorter. When they sketched, her lines lost their ease. What used to be willow trees and turtles had turned to jagged mountain ridges and fleeing birds. One afternoon, she came late. Her braid was rushed, uneven. Her hands trembled as she held out the notebook, trying to act like nothing had shifted. "They say the cavalry's been seen near the high ridge," she said, voice flat. "Some riders passed word to my uncle. We'll move before sundown." Cole stared at her, jaw tight. "Move? As in, for good?" She nodded once. No flourish, no softness, just the truth. He sat down on the riverbank hard, like something had been yanked from under him. "You didn't tell me." "I didn't want to believe it." She sat beside him, close but not touching. "I kept hoping it wouldn't come to this." For a long moment, neither said a thing. The cottonwoods rustled above them, and the river moved like it always had. But something in the current felt off. Faster, more urgent. Like it too sensed a deadline. When the sun dipped low, staining the water amber and blood red, Nita stood. She reached for Cole's hat without asking, and untied the red thread from the rock. Then, with the same fingers that had once plaited flowers into his sleeves, she braided it tighter, tying it back with slow, deliberate knots. "So you won't forget me," she whispered, fastening the final loop. Cole swallowed hard, his throat raw. "I never could." She looked at him then. Really looked. Her eyes were filled with something that hurt more than distance. Certainty. "You'll come back here someday," she said, barely above breath. "Maybe I will too, or maybe I won't. But you'll still have the river. And the red thread." That's enough. They didn't kiss. Didn't promise. They just held each other in a fierce, too short embrace, as if memory itself needed to be branded into skin. And then she turned. No more words. No looking back. She walked into the tall grass where her people waited, into the last rays of the sun, into the kind of silence only heartbreak understands. Cole stood there long after her shadow vanished. The river kept running. But it didn't sing anymore. The years didn't roar in. They crept, like dust through a cracked window. Cole stayed. The ranch became his burden and his lifeline. He buried his father the winter he turned 20. His mother followed not long after, worn out by grief and dry seasons. There were no eulogies, no long speeches, just dirt, wood, and silence. And through it all, that damn river kept flowing. Scout grew slower under him. The fences needed mending more than he had time to give. But Cole worked like a man chasing ghosts. And maybe he was. Because every so often he'd feel it, her, Nita, not in words, not in dreams, but in the way the cottonwoods rustled just before dusk. In the way laughter, soft, light, not quite there, would slip past his ears when he was dead alone. The red-threaded stone still rode on his hat, weathered by sun and time, but never untied. Most folks didn't notice. The ones who did figured it was just ranch superstition. Cole never corrected him. Some nights, he'd ride out past the pastures, past the fence line, past the expectations, past the man everyone thought he was supposed to be. He'd sit by that same bend in the river, grown narrower now, its edges clawed back by floods and seasons, and he'd watch the stars come alive. He remembered the way she had sat beside him without ever needing to talk, how her fingers moved like the wind through sagebrush, how her eyes held more truth than any preacher ever dared to speak. He'd see her then almost, not clearly, not in some dreamlike shimmer, but in the posture of a deer drinking at the water's edge. In the hush before dawn, broke. Cole never married. Folks whispered, as they do, said maybe he was too proud, or too quiet, or too strange. One woman tried once, soft eyes, calloused hands, meant well. But Cole pulled away before spring even had the chance to bloom. She didn't ask why. Maybe she saw it too, that he already belonged to someone he hadn't seen in years. The town got louder. Rail lines came closer. Barbed wire boxed in what used to run free. But Cole remained. And so did the thread. Faded to rust red now, but firm. He'd touch it before every branding, every ride into a storm, every graveside he stood beside. And sometimes, Just before sleep took him, he'd whisper something into the dark. I remember. I still do. The river might have changed. The world surely had. But the part of him she touched? That part never healed, never tried to, because some wounds aren't meant to close. Cole had stopped expecting anything good to come out of the horizon. He rode to town once a week now, trading hides and salt, nodding through conversations that felt more like chores than courtesies. Folks knew him, respected him even, but nobody knew him. Not really. Not the part that still rode out to the river, chasing echoes. It was early fall when it happened. The light was slanting low and gold, the kind of light that blurred edges and made ghosts out of dust. He'd taken the long trail home, out past the dry ridge and down toward the cottonwoods, when he spotted smoke curling up from near the old river bend. A camp. Temporary from the looks of it. Maybe travelers. Maybe trouble. Either way, he slowed Scout and pulled off to the side. He wasn't looking for anything. But something found him. A flicker of movement near the water caught his eye. Someone kneeling, backlit by the river's shine, scooping water into a tin pail with easy grace. The breeze caught a strand of hair, black and long, and the sun caught the edge of her profile. And Cole stopped breathing. He blinked, then blinked again, jaw clenched so tight it ached. No, it wasn't possible. The face was older, the braid longer, the shoulders stronger. But the way she moved, the tilt of her head, the poise in her spine, it lit a match in the dry tinder of his memory. He gripped his saddle horn hard, unsure if he was seeing her or remembering her. It can't be. Still, he couldn't tear his eyes away. He dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the dirt like drum beats. He didn't move toward the camp, just stood beneath a crooked cottonwood, watching like a man waking from a fever dream. The woman didn't turn, didn't speak, just filled the bucket and stood, wiping her hands on her skirt. And for a moment, when the sun caught her face, his heart bucked hard in his chest. It's her, it's Nita, but his mind fought it. It's been too long, too far, too many years and not enough reasons. Still, the red thread on his hat weighed heavier than usual. Cole stepped back, mounted Scout, and rode the long way home without looking back. But that night, he didn't sleep. Couldn't. The fire crackled in the hearth. The wind moved slow against the windows, but inside him something was racing, pounding, demanding. Could she have come back? After all these years? After all this silence? He pulled the hat from its hook and stared at the stone hanging from the band, still tied tight with the red thread she'd braided herself. That weight in his chest wasn't grief anymore. It was hope. Terrifying, wild, foolish hope. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Cole lay in the dark, the fire burned low, and the weight of something unfinished pressed down on his chest like a saddle cinched too tight. He rolled onto his side, staring at the red threaded stone hanging from the peg where his hat rested. It swung slightly with the wind sneaking through the chink in the window. And it was calling. Or maybe she was. By dawn, he'd already saddled Scout and headed out. No coffee, no breakfast, just a pull in his gut, stronger than habit or reason. Something deeper, something older. The trail to the river looked the same as it had for years. Ruts carved by time, cottonwoods whispering secrets, the water flashing silver beneath the morning sun. But Cole felt different. Every hoofbeat echoed like a drum roll. As he neared the bend, he slowed Scout to a quiet walk, heart hammering hard beneath his worn shirt. The camp was still there, modest and quiet, canvas stretched between branches, a cookpot cooling on a stone circle. And there she was, kneeling again by the river, her back to him, the hem of her skirt dusted with dew. She moved slow, deliberate, dipping her hands into the water like she knew exactly what she was doing, and exactly who might be watching. Cole dismounted without thinking, boots hitting soft dirt. He took a breath, and then another. He didn't know what the hell he was going to say. Didn't know if it was her. Or worse, if it was, and she no longer remembered him at all. Still, he stepped forward. His voice cracked the stillness. "Mornin', ma'am." She didn't startle, didn't flinch, just paused, then straightened up slow, and turned. Her face was calm, but her eyes, those dark, wildfire eyes, searched him like she'd been waiting to. A silence stretched between them, sharp and heavy. Finally, Cole cleared his throat, tugged at his hat brim. "Didn't mean to intrude. I just saw the smoke yesterday. Thought I'd check on the land." He was lying, and they both knew it. The woman looked at him a long moment, expression unreadable. Then something shifted. She tilted her head and smiled. A small, knowing thing, not wide, not giddy, but deep, like a canyon smile shaped by years. "I was wondering how long you'd take," she said. Her voice hadn't changed. Not really. And just like that, every scar inside Cole burned fresh. It was her. Nita. He didn't answer. Just nodded once. Slow. His hand twitched at his side, brushing against the red-threaded stone like it needed reassurance that this wasn't a dream. It wasn't. She was real, and she was standing 10 feet from him, steady as ever. Cole didn't move, didn't speak. The air between them was so still it felt breakable. She stood steady, her silhouette framed by the bend in the river that had once belonged to them. Nita. Older now. The sharp edges of youth had softened, but her fire hadn't dimmed. She looked like she'd weathered the land and come out stronger for it. There were faint lines around her eyes, earned, not regretted, and a weight in her shoulders that only time can carve. But her gaze? Still wildfire, still full of truths she hadn't said yet. She took a step closer, lips curled into that same half-smile that used to break tension like a twig under boot. "You gonna say something, cowboy?" she asked. "Or are you just gonna stare at me like a ghost?" Cole tried to speak, but only managed a breath. Then she said it. "Don't you recognize me?" It hit him like a rifle butt to the chest. He took a small step back, then forward again, like his legs didn't know what to believe. I do," he whispered. "I think I've been trying not to." She tilted her head. "Why's that?" "Because if I believed it was really you, I don't know if I could survive losing you again." The moment broke something in him. His voice cracked. His hand, almost without thinking, reached up to his hat, thumb brushing the red-threaded rock like a prayer. She saw it, and her smile faltered. Her eyes welled, but she didn't blink them back. "You kept it?" "Every damn day," Cole said. "Even when the color faded. Even when folks thought I was a fool for holding on to something I couldn't explain." She stepped forward slowly until they stood barely a foot apart. She reached out, fingertips brushing the stone tied to his hat, then his cheek. Her touch was careful, like she wasn't sure if he was real either. "I told you it'd remind you that you're never alone," she said. "I wasn't," he replied, voice gravelly. "You were always there, in my mind, in the river, in the sound of the wind." They stood there, just breathing in the moment. The river whispered behind them. The cottonwoods creaked. Somewhere, a bird called out like it was welcoming something home. Cole finally asked the question that had lived in his chest for over a decade. "Why now?" Nita looked past him to the water. Because I couldn't stay away any longer. And because maybe I hoped you hadn't let go. He shook his head slowly, jaw clenched. Let go? Nita, I never even tried. They sat side by side on the bank, knees brushing, just like they had all those years ago. Only this time, the silence wasn't shy. It was earned, built on the weight of time and the knowledge of all the miles life had carved into them. Cole looked older now, more worn than rugged, the lines around his mouth etched by dust, labor, and solitude. But Nita? She carried her years with the same quiet defiance he remembered. Still graceful, still steel beneath skin. They didn't rush, didn't reach for big words, just let the river talk for them a while. Then, slowly, the dam cracked. He told her about the years since she'd gone, about burying his folks, the empty house, the quiet ache of riding fence lines with no one waiting at home. He talked about how he'd touch the red thread every morning before saddling up, just to remind himself he hadn't dreamed her. She listened, chin tucked, eyes soft. When he was done, she took his hand. Hers was warm, calloused, familiar. My life didn't get quieter, she said, voice low. We moved, a lot, followed the old trails, hid from soldiers, sickness, sometimes even other tribes. I learned how to stitch wounds, how to skin rabbits, how to keep my family breathing when the land wanted to swallow us whole. Cole didn't interrupt. He just watched her, holding every word like it might vanish if he looked away. I thought about you, she added. More than I should have, maybe. Every time we crossed a river, I wondered if it flowed into yours, if the wind I felt had passed you first. He swallowed hard. It did, she smiled, but it was tinged with sorrow. The truth is, I came back hoping you'd still be here, but I also came knowing I couldn't stay. The words hung heavy. Cole looked down at their hands, still linked. You leaving again? Nita nodded slowly. My family moves with the land. We don't get to settle, not yet. Maybe not ever. He didn't plead, didn't beg. That wasn't how men like him were built. But his silence was loud. I didn't want to break you twice, she whispered. You didn't, he said, throat thick. You just marked me, like a brand. They sat in the hush, staring at the water that had always been between them. Not a barrier, a bridge, forged not by smooth days but scarred ones. They had lived separate lives, but somehow they had ended up here, on the same bank, under the same sky, holding the same memory. And maybe that was enough. For now. At dawn, Cole saddled Scout in the chill before sunrise. The air smelled like sage and riverstone, the kind of scent that made a man believe in beginnings, even when he was staring at another end. Nita stood a few paces back, wrapped in her blanket, hair braided with red thread like it always had been. But there was something new in her eyes. Something settled. Not peace exactly, but understanding. She'd said what she came to say. And so had he. They didn't hug, didn't kiss. That wasn't their way. They'd never needed grand gestures to speak what ran deep. You sure about this? Cole asked, voice gravel and wind. Nita nodded. There's still too many who need me. Sisters, aunties, a little boy who reminds me of you when you were half wild and all dust. That made him smile, soft and crooked. I kept this for you, he said, reaching into his coat. He handed her a small, worn notebook, edges curled, pages smudged with dirt and memory. She opened it. Inside, her own drawings from when they were kids. Rivers, animals. One sketch of the two of them beneath a cliff, sitting cross-legged, passing something between them. maybe a story, maybe a promise. Her fingers lingered on the page like it was a relic. "I never stopped drawing," she said. "I just stopped sharing." "Well," he said, tightening the saddle strap. "Maybe that's the trick. Maybe we weren't meant to have each other. Maybe we were meant to shape each other." The words hung between them like a thread pulled taut across time. She stepped forward, placed something in his palm. A river stone. Flat, smooth, etched with a spiral burned in by fire. "So you don't forget where we started," she whispered. "I never did." Their eyes locked one last time. Not as children, not even as lovers, but as two people who had once built a world between them when the real one couldn't hold them. Then she turned, walked toward the horizon, toward her people, her path. Cole stood there a long while, stone in hand, horse silent beside him. The sun crept up behind him, stretching his shadow long across the grass. He didn't cry, but his chest ached like something sacred had moved through it, and left just enough behind to keep him warm on the cold days. By the river that had once been theirs, the wind carried her scent for a few more minutes. And then, it was just water again. But every time the wind shifted, he'd hear her laugh in the cottonwoods, and every time he held that stone, he'd remember. Not all goodbyes mean the end. Some are just the kind of love the land can carry. Quiet, steady, and eternal. And have you ever loved someone enough to let them go just so they could remain whole?